Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about something that's a little bit on the tricky and confusing side, but I believe in all of you, so hang in there and we got this. It's called the demographic transition model. All right, a lot of big words there. Demography is the first word to define in that whole little title there. Demography is the study of a location's population growth, right? It could be growth or decline, but it's the changes in a country's population over a period of time, okay? So the demographic transition model, also known as the DTM, because I don't always feel like saying the whole word, it says it allows us to see how population changes or transitions over time, right? The DTM shows us that each part of the world is going through similar transitions over time. Okay, that does not mean that every country gets to that same transition at the same time. It just means that every country kind of goes through its transitions in the same kind of way because of the same sort of factors for the most part. So even though the United States might have gotten to a different stage of this DTM hundreds of years before other countries make it there, the reason for its change is often quite similar. Okay, and then it also provides sort of a roadmap, so to speak, so that we can predict or guess what a country's population is going to do in the future. So if we know where a country's population is right now, and we can kind of see its momentum, we can figure out where it's going to head, whether it's going to start getting faster, right, faster growth, or if the growth rate is going to go down, or if the growth of the country is actually going to go in reverse. So the 5 stages of the demographic transition model are going to be laid out here. I'm going to give examples of each and kind of explain the process. So please know that this is not going to be easy, but I'm going to try to make it as understandable as possible. So look at this chart. Don't panic. It's a lot, right? If you look at the whole thing at once, it becomes quickly overwhelming. So let's look at it piece by piece, right? It says that the black line, this line here, represents deaths over time, okay? So over time, the death rate in a country should go down as that country progresses, as its technology and medicine improves, okay? Now let's look at this gray line, okay? The gray line that's right here, you can see that that is births, okay? The birth rate. So notice that people have a lot of kids in the first few stages of the country's existence, but then as things modernize, as technology improves, as people need less and less kids, that line goes right down, okay? The red line right here, okay, you can see this red line, that represents the resulting population. So if at the beginning here the death rate and the birth rate are almost the same, well then the population stays very low and very slow moving. But if the birth rate continues to be high while the death rate starts to fall due to improvements in technology, then what happens is that the birth rate is much higher than the death rate. That leads to a high rate of natural increase. And so then you start to see the red line, the population line, shooting upwards, okay? Over time, you see that the birth rate starts to fall as well, as people are saying, you know what, hold up, we don't really need to have 5, 6, 7 babies per family. We can have 2 or 1. And so then the birth rate goes down. At the same time, technology continues to improve, and you see that the death rate declines as well. So as births and deaths both decrease, the rate of population growth also slows down, right? It comes to a peak. So for a while it's going, but then it comes to a peak as people stop having so many babies. And that's just kind of how that works. All right. So let's go through these stages specifically now, one at a time. All right. So in the first stage, it's a very, very low rate of growth. Okay. The vast majority of world history, tens of thousands of years of world history, every part of the world was stuck in stage 1 of the DTM. And that's because birth rates had to be super high because if you had 7 kids, there's no guarantee that more than one or two of them are actually going to grow into adulthood. As bad as that sounds, people had a bunch of kids because you didn't know how many were going to make it. The death rate was also super high. The chance of living past the age of 40 was probably pretty low. So because the birth and the death rate are super high, kids are needed for farming, medicine is garbage, there's really nothing going on there. So that means that the rate of increase, like I said before, pretty much stayed at nothing. So even though it's tons and tons of babies, but it's also tons and tons of deaths, so the population stays super low, right? You can't grow a population when births don't exceed deaths. So today in the world, almost nowhere are you going to find a stage 1 group of people. You're not going to find any stage 1 countries. You might find the occasional isolated group living in jungle settings or deep into the rainforest of certain places, but even that is really rare these days in the world, okay? So stage 1 is pretty much gone at this point, right? A lot of countries that made it first into stage 2 did so in the late 1700s as the Industrial Revolution began to really kind of kick in and improve things. So like I just said, stage 2 involves super fast population explosion, right? In the 1700s, 1800s, the Industrial Revolution improves lives for a lot of people. It improves medicine. And so there's still a really high birth rate because a lot of people are still living in rural settings, working on farm jobs, and families would have needed to have those 5, 6, 7, 10 kids to support the farms. All right. But because of improvements in technology, the death rate is plummeting. So that leaves, people still having a ton of babies, death rate going down, all that kind of in between. It means that the population is shooting through the roof, okay? Now, today in the world, there's a lot of countries that are still in that, right? Even though most countries in the developed world made it there in the 1800s, there are some countries that are stuck kind of behind. So a lot of sub-Saharan African nations are still left in stage 2, where they're continuing to have 5, 6, 7 kids on average, right? The total fertility rate is staying pretty high. But the death rate is going down due to changes in medical technology and access to medicine and vaccines and things like that. Okay, so this is stage 2. You see that the population is starting to go upwards quickly, very quickly. Okay. Well, then you get to stage 3. Okay, the most developed countries got there around the late 1800s, maybe the early 1900s. People are shifting away in large amounts. They're shifting away from the need for having children for farm work and chores and stuff like that. As they move into cities, right, it's not economical for a family to have 6 kids if you're living in a city. Because houses were smaller because you're living in those tight quarters. So more industry, less farming. And then also as countries gain more rights for women, as they gain more access to things like contraception, right? That's a fancy way of saying birth control, condoms. There's also education for family planning and things like that. Suddenly people are starting to realize, okay, I don't need to have, 7, 8 children. We can have 2 children, we can have 3 children, and so you start to see the death rate is still going down because there are additional changes and improvements in medicine. So sanitation and medicine improve, meaning the death rate is still going down, not at the same rate it was here, but you can see the death rate is decreasing just a little bit. But this is where the population, the birth rate is starting to really go down. So population in stage 3 is still cruising pretty quickly, but not at the same rate that it was increasing during stage 2. All right. In the world today, you can see you have Brazil, you have India, Mexico, Colombia, Jamaica, all these different developing nations around the world where things are improving. All right. I got to keep going quick here because I got to keep my video under 15 minutes. Stage 4, all right? Stage 4 means that there is pretty much no growth happening, or if there is, it's a very slow increase, okay? The birth rates are down. People are really not having kids at the same rate that they used to. The average might be just at replacement rate, meaning people are having just enough kids to match the death rate, right? So the death rate is here, and so is the birth rate, and so there's really no growth. If the birth rate is slightly higher, let's say maybe it's at the total fertility rate is maybe 2.5 children per family, and the replacement rate would be 2.4. That means that there's just a little bit of growth in that country. Okay, so because of better healthcare yet, right, access to great medical services and vaccines and sanitation and education and all these things that you would see in a developed country, those countries have entered stage 4. And you see by then the birth rate has plummeted, the death rate has also bottomed out. I mean, at some point, you can't get the death rate any lower, right? Unfortunately, in the world, one of the only things that's definite is that people do at some point have to die. And so in stage 4 countries, you bottomed out the death toll. People aren't dying from those crazy things that should be preventable anymore. They're dying because of, in most cases, from natural causes, from old age, simply. Okay. So you can see that a lot of parts of the world, the developed parts of the world, the United States, Canada, most of Europe, South Korea, Argentina, Australia, these are all places where the birth rate has kind of matched or met the death rate. And then lastly, we have an actual decline in population once we get to stage 5. Up until recently, stage 5 wasn't even a real thing. But now, I should also mention stage 4, a lot of countries got there in like the 70s and 1980s. Okay. Stage 5 is a pretty recent thing. Okay. Stage 5, in your textbooks, because your textbooks are 10 years old, it might still say that it's theoretical. Nowadays, it's not theoretical. It's a thing that's happening in some places. People are having, we bottomed out the death rate, right? Like I said, that can't get any lower. Physically, it can't get any lower. But the birth rates are even lower than the death rates, meaning people are having so few kids that deaths actually exceed births. So people in some countries such as Japan, Germany, Portugal, Italy is another example. People just family preferences, the average amount of kids per family could be at 2.0 or even fewer, right? A lot of people are choosing to only have one kid. And so that brings the average down. And as a lot of these countries are getting older, right, the population is an aging population. It means a lot of people are getting into their 80s and their 90s. And as the population of old people is starting to die off, and you don't have that many kids, not that many babies entering the world, right, like I said, the death toll is actually higher than the birth rate. And so that leads to a gradual decline in population. And that's when countries start to actually get a little bit concerned at that point, right? Because now they're like, oh no, who's going to take care of all of the old people as they age if young people aren't, if people aren't having that many kids? Who's going to step in and fill all of these jobs in our economy if people aren't having kids? So stage 5, right, it's a sign of major progress. And I will just say really quick here to kind of wrap up, tens of thousands of years, like I mentioned, human population really didn't grow, right? Because births and deaths were almost the same. It wasn't until the 1800s that we saw our first billion population, and now we zoomed right on up through the stages. Every country in the world, right, has kind of gone through. Much of them have made it into stage 4. The stage 3 in 2 countries right now is where most of the population growth is occurring, right? Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, parts of Southern Asia. That's where the population is still continuing to go really quickly. But as they continue to improve, as they continue to catch up, by the year 21 or by the year 2050 or by the year 2075, every country in the world should hopefully be at least to stage 4, and that means thankfully, our world's population is going to level out, and we might hit 11 billion, we might hit 12 billion, but then that's where things will kind of stop, hopefully. So, a lot of stuff. Please ask me if you have any questions that you need clarified, because this is confusing. I understand, but Hang in there, write this down, go through these notes a few times, and you got this.